Hey, welcome back. In today's video, we're going to talk about designing a device compliance architecture in Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And so in today's video, we're going to talk about three different things. One, what is device compliance? Two, what are the signals that make up device compliance? And three, how do I bring all of this together to design my own architecture on device compliance? Okay, so I got my architect hat here, and let's get to architecting. Okay, let's talk about your strategy before we jump into architecture. This is actually really important. I want you to ask yourself a question. Ask your stakeholders the question. Ask your sponsor the question. Why are we even doing this? You're watching my video for a reason. It's because you're interested. But I want you to now look at it and say, well, what can I do with this information? Do I even need to do anything with this information? Ask yourself, what problem are we trying to solve with device compliance? Does this even make sense for our organization? Hey, I've met some organizations out there that they don't have a device compliance policy. Doesn't make sense given their business model and what they do. Other organizations, makes total sense. You'll have to figure that out. So what are you trying to solve here? Why do you even care about device compliance? Is this an industry regulation thing? Is this just because we want to increase our security posture and lower risk? I mean, of course, it's cool tech, but let's be real about it. Does this really matter to our organization and how we do business? I also want you to examine, how does this fit into your digital transformation strategy? This is a longer conversation, obviously, but I want you to think about, if we enforce device compliance, can this help us with hybrid work scenarios for our employees? Can this help us with outsourcing our business to contractors? Because maybe that's something we've been looking at doing. What's the kind of business outcomes that this might support? Now, as a security person, as an IT person, I think about, how does device compliance fit into the zero trust strategy? So that's going to be something you're going to want to examine. And then I'm sure there's other questions you could ask here, but another question would be, do you even own Microsoft Intune in Microsoft Endpoint Manager? If you do you want to use additional capabilities and features of it? If you don't, is that a path you want to go down? And same with Azure Active Directory Premium, specifically conditional access. So, because it's going to require Microsoft Endpoint Manager and Microsoft Intune to do device compliance, but then there's additional capability and actually value by integrating it with conditional access. But again, those are questions you're going to have to ask to see, is that something we even want to do? Now, you also have to understand and ask, are we even ready for this? Again, it's cool tech, but let's crawl, walk, run here. So what are the risks of not doing this? In other words, are we going to lose our industry regulation, compliance with our industry regulation, as an example, right? Have you identified an executive sponsor, and have you also identified executive stakeholders? I'll be honest with you, the CIO and CISO, they could certainly be one of the executive sponsors and stakeholders, but you really need somebody out there in the business that can really sponsor this, and somebody that can communicate it effectively to the employee population and talk about, this is why we're doing it, this is why it's so important, and this is how it impacts you and what's in it for you. So did you also partner with those sponsors and stakeholders to create the business justification? This does have ramifications to the business. If you get device compliance wrong, it can impact the business and the way you do business. People could lose productivity, and that could be a bad thing. Now, being in IT, you're also going to understand, do we have the technical skills for this? Do we understand Microsoft Endpoint Manager? Do we understand Azure Active Directory conditional access? If we have a third-party MDM provider, do we understand that? Do we understand how all that's integrated? What about BYOD? How does that fit into all of this? Does my IT help desk and my security operations center, do they have the appropriate skills for this? Do we need to create a procedure? So what happens when a device goes out of compliance, and how to troubleshoot it, monitor it, manage it, configure it, all of those things. And then also think about the organization and the readiness around that. When a device goes out of compliance, how's an end user going to respond when they find out they can't check their email because their device is out of compliance? What does that look like? Do they understand the importance of device security? An important question is, do we have an information security policy that applies to all end users and all employees? Do they have to abide by it as a part of the employee handbook that they have to actually sign? Is device compliance included in that policy? What kind of training and awareness campaign is required for this with those end users and even IT? And again, there's a ton of other questions here we could ask, but do end users actually understand what's in it for them? So I can't answer these questions for you, but these are questions you're going to have to ask yourself, your peers, your stakeholders, your sponsors to make sure you do device compliance right. Okay, let's talk about requirements. I love this conversation. This is probably a bigger conversation. And now that I think about it, I might create another video just around, as an architect, how do you define requirements all up? So we'll save that for another day. But as far as device compliance is concerned, I included the first one here. We're talking about Microsoft Endpoint Manager and Microsoft Intune. So if you're not using Intune as your primary MDM provider, maybe you're using Jamf for your Apple devices and, I don't know, Mobile Iron as an example for everything else. Well, what's it look like? What's our plan to go use Intune and Endpoint Manager? So that's an important question here. Now, I firmly believe that there is a difference between business requirements and technical requirements. There is a difference. Business requirements are around how does this enable the business, number one, but number two, what do I need to do with the solution to make sure that my users are still productive, to make sure that it keeps my industry regulations compliant? I need to define those business requirements and then let those business requirements define the technical requirements. How is a solution going to be configured? I mentioned operating system version, or I will actually in an upcoming slide. I'll mention operating system version. How does that tie back to business requirements? So you're going to want to define those. Now, if you can't define them and you're having trouble, obviously think through, how do we create those requirements? Do you need to identify stakeholders? Do you need to create a V team within the organization and a project plan to go through and define those requirements? For a lot of organizations, you may need help. And, this is not an ego thing either. This is where some of these organizations, and you may be in one, they have very complex information security strategies and very complex IT departments. At a very large enterprise organization, you may want to bring in a third-party consulting firm to help you define all of these requirements and really think through this. Okay, so let's talk about device compliance. What exactly is this? Well, I put together this slide, and please don't worry, I'll put a link to where you can download this entire PowerPoint presentation in the video description. But I put together this slide to help you understand how device compliance actually works. So device compliance is a policy that you create inside Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And that policy is dependent on the operating system. So I'd have a different policy for each OS. And I could define different parameters for those policies. Now, I'm not going to do a deep dive into this, but I will show some slides coming up with some examples of some of the parameters. But here's some examples in the green box. What version of OS? I mentioned that before. So maybe I only want Mac OS computers to connect to my corporate resources when they're running a specific version of operating system. That may be because of supportability reasons for my help desk. That may be because of security reasons. That may be because of many different reasons. So I could specify that. And if I actually connect with a Mac OS device that is using a version that is not on that policy, well, that automatically places my device out of compliance, which I'll come back to here in a moment. I may want to check the device to see, is it jailbroken? Is it rooted? If it is, place out of compliance. And you get the idea. There's many different parameters I can specify here. Now, this is not something that you just want to go through and click yes, 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 yes for all of these. You will have a bad day, I promise. This is where you want to think about the business requirements and the technical requirements, and why are we even doing this to define this policy. Now, I mentioned you can have a policy per OS. So maybe my Mac devices have a different policy than my iOS devices. Maybe I might have different policies based on the types of users. Again, what are my requirements? Now, I can feed in signals from a third-party MDM provider. So maybe I'm using Jamf as an example for my Apple devices. I can feed that signal into Intune and then evaluate whether or not the device is compliant or non-compliant. So is that a requirement for this? Another thing I want you to think about is the requirements for non-compliance and what you take action on. So if my device is non-compliant because maybe the firewall is disabled, well, do I want to send an email to an end user? What does that look like? Do I need to create an email template for that? Do I need to get legal to buy off on that? What does that look like? Do I want to put URLs in there back to maybe the help desk website? Do I want to notify the user? Do I want to remotely lock it? Do I want to do a selective wipe? There's some things I need to think through there. And again, I may want to do that based on the type of user, which I'll come back to in a moment. Now, once the device is marked as compliant, well, we're just going to allow access to that corporate resource, to the email app, or to the website that's trying to be accessed, or whatever it may be. But if it's not compliant, this is where it gets interesting. This is where we can block access to that corporate resource. So not only can we do these actions for non-compliance that are in the red box there, but if I feed this into conditional access in Azure Active Directory, I can then use that compliance state, compliant, non-compliant, to gate access to that resource over here on the right. Maybe it's a third-party SaaS app like Salesforce or Slack or Zoom or whatever, Office 365. Maybe it's a workload running in a third-party cloud. Maybe it's the productivity apps for Microsoft 365 like Outlook or Teams or Power BI. Maybe it's an on-premises line of business app that I'm integrating with one of Microsoft's secure hybrid access partners, or I'm using Microsoft's Azure Active Directory app proxy for that. So I want to think through my different parameters and variables here and the integration points in my architecture to figure out how do I want to get this thing configured. But again, it all is dependent on those requirements we talked about in the previous slide. Now in the middle here, I also have some additional controls. So not only can I not only can I require that the device is compliant, I may also want to require MFA as an example. Or the device is managed, meaning it's joined to Azure Active Directory, or it's hybrid joined through on-premises Active Directory, Windows Server Active Directory. So this is how device compliance works. Now, the blue hyperlinks here will send you out to some different links to documentation where you can learn more. Okay, I know what you're thinking. Matt, I thought this was a video on architecture. It is. But when you develop an architecture, I believe you also need to understand how the product works, which we just talked about, but then also understand what settings are available. So I'm going to take you through some of that now. When I go into device compliance configuration in Microsoft Intune, in Microsoft Endpoint Manager, I'm going to be asked to specify some global settings here. So things like if the device has no compliance policy, do I want to make sure it's compliant or non-compliant, or mark it as compliant or non-compliant? Enhanced jailbreak detection, the validity period for that compliance status, how long is it good for? If the device goes out of compliance, how do I want to notify the end user? Here I can create a notification policy where I include text in an email, some logos of my organization. I can create this in different languages, different locales. And then as I mentioned before, you create a compliance policy per operating system. And so here's the OSs that are currently supported. And then I assign that policy to either a security group of users or I assign it to all users. Now, don't worry, if you assign it to all users, the system is intelligent enough to know that if this is a Windows policy and I'm signing in from an Android device, it's smart enough to know that, okay, I'm not going to apply it because that's the wrong policy for that OS. But I may just want to create one policy per OS and just have that blanketed across my environment to all users. Or based on my requirements, I may want to have different groups of users. Maybe my executives or my VIPs have a different policy than my regular information workers, as an example. And then as part of that policy, if the device is non-compliant with that policy, what do I want to do? Do I want to send that email, which goes back to over here on the left? Do I want to notify them? Do I want to retire it? We talked about that we talked through that on the previous slide, but this is where I can go configure that. So again, it's important to understand what's available. So that helps to inform how you create your architecture here and design your compliance policies. Now, I mentioned previously that you can feed in signals from a third-party mobile device management provider. So within Microsoft Endpoint Manager, if I go to tenant administration here, I can create a compliance partner. Now, these are MDM providers that have worked with Microsoft to do special integrations. And I can choose one of these to then create that integration or connect that solution rather and integrate it with my tenant. And then I would assign it. And so I could choose from one of these here. Now, I can have multiples as well. So if I use, say, Jamf for, I don't know, Mac OS, and I use Mobile Iron for iOS and Android, I can have multiples. And I put some links here to documentation. I'll walk you through that. And then I can let that inform my conditional access policy, because what's going to happen here, folks, is that third-party MDM, it's going to look at the compliance state of that device. And that compliance state is defined inside that third-party MDM. So you would have your own policy inside Jamf. And then Jamf would then tell Intune and Endpoint Manager whether or not it's compliant or not compliant. And I can let that information flow into conditional access and let it flow into my global setting for non-compliance, like emailing the end user. Now, this is pretty interesting. You could also, if you run Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, the EDR and anti-malware solution, then you can share that risk signal back with Endpoint Manager. So here's an example in Windows 10 and 11, where if the device score, risk score, is a certain level, mark it as compliant or non-compliant. So this example require the device to be at or under the machine risk score of whatever. So maybe I want it to be at or below low for the device to actually be in compliance. So if I install malware on it and it gets to medium or high, that's going to place me out of compliance. And over on the right are examples of what that looks like for the other operating systems. Now, at the time that I created this, folks, it's important to know that this specific capability is not available for Mac OS. Defender for Endpoint does support Mac OS, but this integration with device compliance is not supported. Now, what if I'm using a third-party mobile threat defense provider, like Lookout or Zimperium or Sophos or BlackBerry? Well, I can integrate that with Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So here I am inside connectors and tokens and mobile threat defense. I can add one of those connectors to those third parties. And this is where Microsoft has already done work with that third party. And then when I create that compliance policy, check it out. This is where I can go to device health for each operating system and specify that risk level, that score. So this becomes interesting when I go back and think through my technical requirements. Maybe I want to make sure that these devices are at a low score or below in order to get access to my corporate environment. It's interesting, isn't it? Device compliance, I think about the power that this has, and it's extremely powerful. But it's all based on how it's configured. And as you can see, just running through some of this and look at the screenshots and what I've shared with you, there's a lot of complexity to it, or has the potential to be complex. And so this is where you want to really go back and understand, why are we doing this? How does it enable the business? What are my business requirements from that? And then what are my technical requirements that are derived from the business requirements? And understanding, who are my executive sponsors? Who are my executive stakeholders? What are the integration points with any kind of third party, like that mobile threat defense partner or that third party mobile device management provider? And bringing all that together. So when it comes to building your architecture, you've already done the heavy lifting, kind of thinking through some of this. I want you to get it on paper. This is where, I don't want to put a lot of work on you, but this is where you do want to start a document and call it your design guide, where you talk through, here's a section for the requirements, here's why we're doing it, business, technical, here's our communication plan, here's our awareness campaign, here's how we're going to support it inside IT, here's actually how it's going to be configured per policy and all the parameters per policy. here's an architectural diagram that you've created of all the integration points from my mobile threat defense providers and my MDM providers and conditional access and all of those different things, and having all of that in a document. Now, when you build that document, this is not up to you. This is not a you thing. This is a team thing. So who do I need to bring into my V team from around the organization to help me build this? Do I need somebody from legal? Do I need other people from around IT? Do I need my security people? Do I need HR? Who do I need? And working together with them to then, as we put it all in the document, we can then have those appropriate stakeholders sign off on it, and then eventually have that executive sponsor or sponsors sign off on it, and then start to roll it out in a POC. So let's lab this up, or let's do a production POC where we apply this just to a few IT people per that document. And then let's let that feedback loop go. And then based on that feedback and the things that we've learned and the insights we've gathered, we're going to make tweaks to those policies and we're going to adjust it as we go. And then when we're ready, we're now going to launch a pilot. And that production pilot might be of IT, but also people out in the business, regular end users. Let that feedback loop run, gather those insights, make tweaks and adjustments accordingly, and then let's roll it out to production. And following that rollout schedule that you define in the document. So folks, as you can see, this is extremely powerful, but there is a method to the madness. And so if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up. Also, I'm releasing new videos all the time, so be sure to subscribe so you can be notified when I release a new video. I also want to know, how are you using device compliance? Let me know down below in the comments. I would love to learn more about how you're using it, or what do you think of this if you're not using it? Is this even useful for your environment? If it's not, no biggie. If it is useful, I would love to know why. Actually, tell me why on both cases. Because that's also going to help out other viewers like yourself when they read through those comments. That gives them a chance to kind of learn from their peers as well. Okay, so as you can see, there's a lot to this. Hopefully this video helped to demystify it a little bit. And I am working on new videos as well. In fact, I'm working on a passwordless architecture video. And so I'm expecting to release that sometime next week. All right, folks, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, and we'll see you in the next video.